Good afternoon and welcome to the INSS at Tel Aviv. My name is Itai. Brun. I'm Deputy Head Director of this institute, and we're talking about the normalization between the UAE and Israel, along with experts from Israel, from the Gulf, and from the US. We'll try to understand the implications of this agreement in 3 or 4 circles. We'll talk about the circle of the relations between Israel and UAE, and to see how this will impact the relations between the 2 countries that were already close. What is the actual meaning of this concept of normalization? We'll talk about the relationship between Israel and other regional countries. Will other countries also follow suit? Is this tightening the affiliations with the Palestinians and increasing the chances of peace between Israel and the regional countries? And we'll talk about the context of the struggle on the nature of the Middle East. Can we establish a common axis that will fight against 3 other axes, the radical Shiite one, the Muslim Brotherhood led by Turkey, and the jihadists who are recovering from the blows that they have received, and perhaps they're regrouping for the future? And if we are seeing an axis here, who are the members of this axis, and how will the other axes, for example, Turkey and Iran, react to this axis? In a more global context, we'll have to talk about the involvement of the superpowers in the Middle East. What significance does the American brokerage have in their leadership, and to what extent does this deal have to do with the I-35? We will hold this discussion in both English and in Hebrew. Our guests are receiving simultaneous interpretation into English, and we'll begin with Dr. Ibtissam El-Katabi, President of the Emirates Policy Center. Switching to English.
Definitely exciting to host you here openly at the INSS conference. I really hope that we can see you soon here in Tel Aviv live, not just through the Zoom. So following the questions I raised at the beginning of the discussion, what in your view are the main implications of the agreement for the Emirates, for the Gulf, and for the broader Middle East? Dr. El-Katabi.
Thank you, and thanks for INSS for this invitation. I'm honored to be with you from Abu Dhabi. Well, since the discussion here is among strategic experts, theorists, and analysts, I will only talk about the likely ramification in the field of strategic analysis. I will summarize the likely ramification of this agreement in the following points. First, the agreement is an unorthodox factor in the regional calculation and might be a game changer at the strategic level if elements of its success are consolidated and chances of its endurance are reinforced. Second, the agreement has courageously surpassed the chronic Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It has presented a new model that overtook all the governing models of the chronic conflict in the Middle East. Third, the agreement is a strategic shift for the 2 sides and some other regional parties. At the same time, the agreement was a strategic shock for some regional parties, since the 2 sides of the agreement have decided to make this shift. This requires an adjustment and change of their whole regional policies to make this agreement succeed.
Shock for whom?
This agreement is a strategic shift for some regional actors and also strategic shock for others where they are state or non-state actors. This means that these parties will adjust or change their strategies of interacting with the 2 sides here, UAE and Israel, the 2 sides of the agreement. This requires that UAE and Israel to make careful strategic calculation and stimulate the most important scenarios expected from influential regional parties, it is also imperative to carry out an analysis of the strategic network of interactions between various parties as a result of this agreement. This agreement requires adjusting, changing narrative formed by each side towards the other in a way that makes the agreement a practical model for change in the region. Since any strategic shifts lead to winners and losers, losers as a result of this agreement might forge interim or partial alliances based on this common denominators. This calls on the UAE and Israel to consider forging a network of regional and international alliances that contribute to the redistribution of power in the region to serve the common interest of this network and minimize risk against it. Thank you.
Thank you. And from your perspective, what does the agreement suggest, if anything, about the role of the United States in the region?
Well, as you know, that United States, either under Obama or even continued under Trump, change its strategic assessment for the region and pivot towards Asia and left the region facing its destiny with Iran. And that is expected that the region will live in peace after the nuclear agreement done. Now, of course, UAE played a great role here, and it should be the guarantee for the peace in the region. And now, this means that US not abandon the region, not leaving the region. There must be, as it was guaranteed for the peace between Israel and UAE, should be also if this will continue to involve other parties in the region.
And again, from your perspective, do you see other Arab states making the same agreement or the same move?
The calculation of UAE might be different than others. So the others are watching, okay, but of course, they will be the followers. They will be the followers. They lost their chance to be the leader as the first in the Gulf to sign this agreement. Now, the others, they are looking, they are seeing the Arab street, the reaction either from the street or from the government in the Arab world, and watching carefully, but I'm sure they will come. Most of them, they have that relation secretly with some of them clearly, and some of them secretly with Israel. So with the time, if this agreement between UAE and Israel represent a success in terms of really bringing peace in the Palestinian territory, or feel the Arabs that this is something encouraging them to follow UAE, and of course UAE before Egypt and Jordan, but I think this is have more power to take it to other way. I think what happened in Egypt didn't move where it is. Might be this is signing more agreement in terms of medical, technology, many aspects and many fields.
Thank you very much, Dr. El-Katbi, and again, hope to see you soon in Tel Aviv. נעבור לדוקטור מורן זגה.
And now we'd like to move on to Dr. Moran Zaga from the Hiking Chair at the Haifa University and expert on the Gulf countries and specifically the Emirates. Good afternoon, Moran. You are on mute, Moran. Were you surprised by the agreement, Brun?
שלום, קודם כל.
First of all, hi everyone.
כן, אבל אני רוצה להתחיל משהו פחות מפתיע.
זה לא מדינה שלא סביר לחשוב עליה במושגים של שלום בישראל.
not a country that it's inconceivable to think about in terms of peace with Israel over the past 2 or 3 decades. We've seen these layers on top of layers in the previous decade. Between 2000 and 2010, it was the decade of tycoons, excellent economic relations, and in the past 5 years, the pace of ties that kept adding and adding, it was immense pace, and there were even multinational relations in the past 5 years, both in diplomacy and in defense issues, and with hosting Israeli delegations, and also on the civilian aspect. In this past year, 2 important additional dimensions were added, both civilian and direct, and also a bit indirect, and these are religious ties between Jews and Muslims, and also in the social media networks, and the Israeli NFA contributed to that as well. And this year there were even more direct ties with the dealing with COVID-19 and the direct assistance and the airplane from the UAE that landed here with humanitarian equipment for the Palestinians. So we've seen these ties growing, and there was always the glass ceiling, and this is the big surprise, and it's worthwhile asking, how did it happen? How come the concept changed, and maybe we didn't even identify it correctly? And I think that as we try to do some soul searching as researchers and say, how come we didn't identify this glass ceiling? The one thing I understand here is that this wasn't just our own wishful thinking. It relied on declarations and on actual measures that kept recurring on all levels of leadership in the UAE throughout the years. If there was one thing that was stable in the relationship between Israel and the Emirates, is that whenever it came to attest the relations, we kept seeing this equation. Precedent after precedent, the other side kept delivering the message that it doesn't change the status of Israel and the issue of the solution of the Palestinian issue. And in this respect, something very profound had changed, because somebody in the UAE had decided to change the equation and to change it all at once. So why now? Why now? Well, that's it. There is the question of timing, and regarding the timing, many others will comment on that, and there's a very broad logic and rationale for this change. And Dr. Al-Katabi also talked about the American angle and how that is connected, the fact that non-Western elements had entered this region in recent months. But diplomatically speaking, there's another surprise here, and the main surprise is that it was in a very urgent context. July 1st had passed, and annexation was no longer on the agenda. And let me point out another surprise, which is very interesting for us as scholars. The magnitude, the impact of this process. Once the announcement was made, short of sending Mohammed bin Zayed to the Israeli Knesset and delivering a speech in Hebrew, Israel did almost everything. People spoke, they wrote in Hebrew in our newspapers. The Foreign Minister Galgash, his declarations about the signing ceremony and embassy that will open up in Tel Aviv. This was very different from everything we saw previously in this public sphere of the UAE. And the president of a research institute in an INSS conference, yes, definitely that too. And you know that they always talk about use the code name, we're the cousins, and it was a direct frontal measure, and it was very different to the entire nature of the state and its relations so far to Israel. So that was very interesting. And I saw a paper you wrote that talked about the similarity between Israel and the UAE. So after all, what does this measure teach us about the nature of the country that you're talking about? Well, for sure. I mean, there are so many layers here that we can look at in a positive way, because if we want a country that will be a leading country, that's a leading country in the Arab world, that is the UAE, you have here unity of interests and very similar worldviews with respect to political Islam and the shared interests and the common challenges. This is a country
that seeks progress. It is a very bold, audacious country with a vision that truly reminds us of our vision here in Israel, this young country that wants to proceed very rapidly and aspire for regional stability, of course. So this is definitely great news and a very important message to Israel. Do you see this connection as part of an axis that exists in the Middle East, you know, versus the other axes? Well, it's important to comment on that because these past few years, recent years, were years where you saw a very significant polarization in the Gulf and the Gulf countries within. And the bad news is that this agreement actually could even increase this polarization, and it will lead each country to feel alone in this region, in this fear feeling that it needs to increase its qualitative edge, its relative edge in the region. So perhaps we're going to see an arms race, and this is something that's already happening in the Gulf today. Every country, we talk a lot about the F-35 aircraft, but it's been over a decade that there have been huge acquisitions of advanced technologies, and the story of the axis, it's very interesting because it's not just the UAE with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt, but also within what we consider to be a conglomerate. Within this conglomerate, there is also a polarization process, and the interest is to have unity and joint action within that, but we also need to look at the opposite trend of an arms race following the polarization that is currently taking place in the Middle East and in the Gulf. Thank you very much, Moran. Now let's move on to Dr. Yoel Guzhansky, who's a senior researcher in the INSS, our expert to the Gulf region. How do you understand the considerations of the people of the Emirates, and what are the implications of these relations in view of the relations that were close between the two countries anyhow? Thank you, Itai. Hello, everyone. I'd like to pick up on what Ibtisam said in her important comments. First of all, in 2014, we almost had an agreement with the UAE, and it's very important, and Moran also mentioned this, we need to think about the current timing. I think there are very important elements to point at. First of all, the timing. I think that without Israel's annexation intent, it would not have happened now, not in this way. And another issue, that's the elections in the US. Now I'd like to talk about the motivation. First of all, with respect to the US, I believe that this is the main motivation. The purpose is to improve the image of the UAE, to strengthen the brand, this brand called the United Arab Emirates, especially in American Congress and with the Democrats. It's been tarnished, this brand, in recent years because of the proximity to Yemen and other issues. And it's also intended to strengthen the relations between the US and the UAE. I mean, we've had this entire festival in Israel this past week about the F-35, but actually it's much broader than the F-35. There's this fear in the UAE, just like in other Gulf countries, with the absence of a stable American support. And the return is an attempt to strengthen the relations with the US, especially with respect to Iran. And that's alongside the weapons we're talking about. Maybe we're also talking about certain quiet understandings that are intended to deter Iran. There's an attempt to give a certain response to Trump with the background of elections. And now maybe they can receive more than what Biden, if he is to be elected, would give the UAE if we're talking about weapons. Arms deals, it's important to remember, arms deals had always been part of peace accords between Israel and its neighbors whenever there was American involvement. I mentioned Biden. People in the Gulf are afraid that Biden will be much softer with Iran and much harder on the issue of human rights and weapons, means of warfare. So, in the region there, we'll soon talk about Oman. But Saudi Arabia and other countries, will they follow suit with the UAE? Maybe later we can talk about how this impacts the regional system and regional processes. But I think that first of all, you know, the United Arab Emirates set a model, just like Ibtisam said, and I believe that this model will exist alongside the existing model that says, first of all, we need to go through the Palestinians. It is not completely it did not completely break this taboo or consensus or the previous model. I think it can exist alongside the model, and every country with its own considerations will choose one of the models. Who can adopt this model, for example? You know what? I'll talk about Saudi Arabia and then I'll move to other countries. First of all, I think it is inconceivable that Mohammed bin Salman was not somehow in the know. I think it's reasonable that he knew about this measure, maybe not exactly about the timing, and also because of the flights. It's been agreed that there will be direct flights, and these flights go through the Saudi airspace. I don't think Mohammed bin Zayed would have done that without informing Mohammed bin Salman. And on the other hand, in Saudi Arabia, there are all kinds of sensitivities that have to do with the religious establishment, what's going on inside the castle, the need to establish his position before his father dies, and also to also entrench its position as the safekeeper of holy sites. So I don't think he will join in the same way or anytime soon or immediately and will establish formal relations with Israel. I think that for Saudi Arabia, the shortcomings are greater than the advantages, especially as long as King Salman is alive. The Palestinian issue is very dear to his heart. He holds the Palestinian portfolio. Farhan, the foreign minister, the Saudi foreign minister, said a few days ago, kind of, poured cold water over this. And he said that the kingdom is still committed to the Arab peace initiative. So who could join? That's a good question. Perhaps Bahrain, perhaps it won't happen in the Gulf even, maybe we'll see an African country. We're so, delighted in Israel. There's this carnival. People are asking, who's next? Who's next? And, every country, and Ibtisam said that every country has its own considerations, its own sensitivities. In the Gulf, we've seen Kuwait speaking against this. Of course, Qatar is, staunchly, personally attacking Mohammed bin Zayed himself for this. Maybe that's a good point to say a few words about the way you perceive the implications on the camps in the region. Maybe we can start with Qatar and Turkey. Well, first of all, you asked about Qatar and Turkey. You know what, before that, let me say something about Israel. Maybe it could complicate our relations with Qatar, and this relationship is very important for Israel in the context of Gaza. They remain behind, and it really embarrassed this surprising move by Mohammed bin Zayed. Maybe he has a problem. Now that created a problem with Qatar, and we need to resolve that. With respect to Turkey, this gets us even more involved in the anti-Turkish axis, and maybe here Israel will face a problem as well. It will get Israel involved in various conflicts it doesn't necessarily want to be involved in. Israel's interest is to reduce the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean and not increase the flames. And, on top of the issue of an arms race, which has already been mentioned, and we've written a lot about it in the INSS in recent years, it's not just an arms race between Iran and the Arab countries, also at the backdrop of the end of the embargo on Iran, but also mainly an arms race between the Arab countries. There's a chance, let's be positive. Yes, there is a chance to expand the circle of peace with Israel. And in the Gulf, it's a good question. What can this do to the relationship with Qatar, between UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar? Does this worsen this relationship? Perhaps it, distances any possibility for a possible agreement. Maybe Israel should precondition this in this package, that there will be some kind of a sulha, some kind of mending the relationship. And I think this further illustrates and emphasizes the fault lines and the way the power is distributed in the system rather than redelineate the regional alliances. I think it merely is indicative of what exists. It doesn't show us of something new. Thank you, Yoel. Now we'll move on to the neighbor of the UAE, Oman, Professor Uchang Hassania, the head of the Department of Political Science in the Sultan Qaus University in Oman. Professor Yaar, it's a great pleasure to have you. Now he's switching to English.
Understand the implication of the deal or the agreement on the Gulf, on the broader Middle East.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very sorry to be late. I had some technical difficulties. I will start by saying that Israel should not really overplay its cards here. The move by the UAE and Israel, as positive as it could really create a very discomfort in the region in general, in a sense that, as it was mentioned by previous colleague, that there are inter-Arab problems, and if Israel tries to push too hard, it could simply aggravate the situation. The second point that I would add is the Palestinian issue. We should not forget that although the states, governments, they could be in favor of engagement with Israel, but we can see that very clearly among the people. There are a lot of suspicions, a lot of questioning, and also a lot of resistance. So Israel should not deepen the gap between the governments and the people, because ultimately, as we know, the majority of these governments are very fragile, and they continue to go through a lot of upheavals. And finally, the role of the US is very important to be seen as a more fair referee in this situation by not to continue alienate the Palestinians, because ultimately everybody recognizes, including I believe many Israelis, that the two-state solution could take us to a new era. And but we don't hear much of that, and especially not a real effort by the White House to implement or to work on that aspect of the conflict. So overall, I would say that we can see a positive move, but the management of this move is excessively important by all parties involved. Already, the previous colleague mentioned the animosities between Qataris and Emiratis, but also the hesitation by the Saudis, and so many other countries. We see also what happened in Sudan, for example. So there is a good potential here to get something positive out of what has been started, but we should not forget the main issue for the majority of Arab people and the Muslims in general is the Palestinian issue. It doesn't mean that they are against or they want to see Israel to be wiped out of the map, as Ahmadinejad and some of his colleagues mentioned. But nevertheless, any faux pas by people like Prime Minister Netanyahu, Americans, Emiratis, and so forth, could really derail the whole thing and reinforce the position of extremists in the region. We know that this move by Emiratis put a lot of pressure on the so-called resistant front, Iran, Saudi Arabia, parts of Iraq, and the Hezbollah. And they try by all means to derail this process, very, very infant, I should say, in its infancy, this process. So there is a need to bring more on board rather than less. So in that sense, there is a need to manage the situation differently, I would say.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the Iranian possible response to this development?
The Iranians talk a lot, but they are not able to act. They have a lot in their plate. We know that this question of continuation of sanctions against the armed and so forth, economic sanctions, So the Iranian regime is really cornered, and very, very badly. Internally, they have immense problems. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point the Revolutionary Guard decided to commit a spectacular move in order to lessen the pressure. This is classic, really, a way of governments who are in difficult situation to get out of that, and it could be that. But generally speaking,
what kind of move, for example?
Yeah, they can push Hezbollah further, although Hezbollah is in a very difficult situation, as we know. But Hamas has a freer hand, Islamic Jihad, and so forth. But also they can push these Fatimiyun, Zainabiyun, their proxies in Syria, as well as Hashd Shabis and other in Iran, in order to come together to do something. But the Islamic Republic itself, at this point at least, I believe they will not get involved in any kind of military action against Israel. As the Israeli sources mentioned time and again, they had more than 1,000 attacks against the Revolutionary Guard, their proxies and so forth in Syria. And the Iranian government, including Revolutionary Guard, they were not able, or they did not see they did not reach that point of no return to react harshly, or at least to attempt to react harshly against the Israelis. So at this point, mostly using the proxies, but not necessarily continuing to do so. And if necessary, so they could use some of those missiles that they show here and there. I did not mention the case of Oman. I'm sorry, you mentioned earlier. I think everybody knows that Oman is one of rare Arab countries that got involved in a kind of dialogue with Israel. This is part of Oman's foreign policy, or at least under Sultan Qaboos's foreign policy. And that was the question of neutrality, good neighborhood, neighboring relations, and so forth. Those were the pillars, and continue, I believe, to be the pillars of Oman's foreign policy. So I think Oman is not going to rush to do what the Emiratis did, but nevertheless, they are there. And this is why I was talking about the management of the issue, to give a better incentive to the Arab governments in order to come out of the closet, as they say, in order to talk to the Israelis more openly.
Thank you very much. And now to Ambassador Barbara Leaf, Director of the Arab Politics Program at the Washington Institute and former American Ambassador to the UAE. Ambassador, in your view, what are the implications for the Gulf, for the Middle East, and for the role of the United States in the region?
So I think all of my colleagues here have touched on some really critical points, and I would say that the main implications are clearly bilateral in the first instance, and the regional, not so much. And I'll explain why I think that. Look, there are unquestionably enormous benefits to be reaped by the UAE and Israel for taking this risk. It was a risk. It was a carefully calculated strategic risk. But the bilateral implications are UAE and US, as you all said, UAE and Israel. Or for the president, for President Trump, you know, this is all gains, all political gains. It's really, most would say that this is not just the most significant foreign policy achievement, but it's the only foreign policy achievement. And let us remember, it happened in a week when there were two rather humiliating setbacks on the key policy plank, which is Iran, for the administration. And I will also say the gains for the administration will be fleeting, because, as you know, we are fully immersed in our electoral cycle, And 98% of the discussion, if not more, 102%, is on domestic issues and on the president's shortcomings in that regard. So it's also important to remind that the deal is a one-off. It's the UAE. It was undertaken by the UAE. It was driven by the UAE, not by the administration. And so I think in that respect, the wider Gulf is still TBD, to be determined. But I mean, we've seen clear indications by the travel schedule of senior officials, Secretary Pompeo first, but also National Security Advisor O'Brien, Jared Kushner. They're all in, they're all rushing out to the region. There's a belief, I will say quite frankly, that Bahrain and possibly Oman are low-hanging fruit. I'm skeptical. I think, just as Dr. Hushan said, the Omani, the Sultan Haytham bin Tariq has clearly continued this moderate, visible relationship with Israel, but that doesn't mean he'll take the further step of normalization. I think there are domestic reasons for that. And on the other hand, Bahrain is in a very different position itself, and we can talk about this, the countries, country by country, if you like. But that's where I think, that's where I'll stop.
And based on your acquaintance with the UAE, what are the implications for the Emirates themselves?
So there were a couple of things that the Emirati leadership was reaching for. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, especially in Israel, about this issue of the F-35. And look, I can tell you that among all of the defense high-tech advanced weapons systems that Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed has been desirous of obtaining, that's the lodestar. But this was not all about the F-35. That's almost a sort of a tactical piece. It does fit squarely into the deal, no question. And we've had Emirati officials say that very openly and publicly now. They were saying it not so publicly a week ago, but they've come full out and said it. But look, it had to do with something else that a number of the speakers touched on, which is where is the US going in terms of the region? The UAE pre-independence and since 1971 has always looked to have to tuck in with a sheltering embrace of a great power. The UK initially for over 150 years, and then the US. And suffice to say, the leadership would like to see that embrace continue. And so this was a directional sort of effort towards Washington. But it's very unclear after two administrations that have shown every evidence of a waning desire. And in the case of the Trump administration, the president himself, a complete abnegation of the formal security role that the US has had towards the Persian Gulf for 40 years now. So in a sense, this is a real hedging movement. You could say it's a maturing moment for this Gulf country looking to a regional superpower not to tuck in under, but to have a partnership with. But at the same time, there are dividends in terms of the US-UAE relationship, because the other thing, going to the strategic level objectives for Mohammed bin Zayed, UAE moves up into a very exclusive club now, club of two, that's fair to say, which is Israel and the UAE for the US in the region. Notwithstanding the close relations with Riyadh, notwithstanding relations with Sisi and so forth, this is a very different move and achievement by Mohammed bin Zayed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Leaf. ונעבור לתת-אלוף במילואים אודי דקל, מנהל המכון.
To Brigadier General Reserves Udi Dekel, who's the director of the INSS, and we'll talk about the significance of this agreement regarding the Palestinian Authority. And let's talk about, has it truly severed the linkage, the coupling between the Palestinian issue and normalization between Israel and regional countries? Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to see all the participants. We couldn't bring a Palestinian participant who can represent the Palestinian view in a more credible way than I, but I'll talk about that perspective. I think there's a feeling among the Palestinians that their share is going down, their stock is going down. They've received several blows recently, even for a long period, and the harshest blow was, of course, the Trump deal that didn't talk about their views, didn't pay any attention to them. Then there was the annexation that perhaps kind of brought up the Palestinian issue back to the agenda on the international arena, but now that has gone down, and that's already irrelevant. And then came, let's call it the third blow, and that's this agreement between Israel and the UAE. And in practice, this agreement breaks a certain power that the Palestinians felt that they had, that is the power of a veto, of preventing Israel from establishing normal relations with Arab countries. And I think there's even greater pain here for them. It's even more painful because actually in this agreement, it is in line with the worldview of Prime Minister Netanyahu, whom the Palestinians hate. And he said that, first of all, that we should reach regional peace and then move on to the Palestinians. And of course, they truly are afraid of that. They're afraid of being left behind, and they are afraid that everybody will establish normal relations with Israel, and then the Palestinian issue will not be resolved. And Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, when he was interviewed about this topic in recent days, he said, "What are you talking about, this achievement of the annexation? Now it's off the stage, but it did not solve the Palestinian problem. So don't talk about achievements which are not achievements." So what is happening here is that the Palestinian Authority is panicking and it is displaying distress. And of course, all of them are denouncing this agreement. They are even defining it as betrayal. And there are certain implications that we need to look at. And you know, in the Palestinian arena, the currents are sometimes very, very slow. Maybe we won't see their development in the near future, but there are a few points we need to pay attention to. We're talking about a unity between Fatah or the PA and Hamas in Gaza, but that's just unity in talk, not in action. And maybe we'll be mistaken on that, just like we thought that we could never reach an agreement without resolving the Palestinian issue, and we found out differently. But the second point, that's a blow to the prestige of Abbas personally, and that his political path that did not bear fruit. And this once again brings back the discourse of resistance. Hamas on the one hand is backing Abbas, but they are also trying to persuade that their path of armed resistance is the right path. And even Jibril Rajoub has been using words that we haven't heard him use for a long time, words like shaheeds and this preparedness to shed Palestinian blood. And well, is it serious? Is it serious or is it just talk? Well, it's talk. They're trying to stir things up, but we've also seen around the annexation that it's very difficult to get the Palestinian people out to the streets. They are sick and tired of both their leadership, both Fatah, both Hamas, and it's not that easy that they will take the streets again in order to take action. Now, I would like to say something from Israel's perspective, and this is what bothers me the most currently. The Palestinian Authority is becoming weaker, and there are certain elements in the Israeli government that want it to continue to weaken. The problem is we don't know at what point will it become so weak that it will become dysfunctional, and that is in contrast to our interest for them to be dysfunctional, because that means it will once again be our responsibility to take care of the Palestinian population. So I don't think Israel should stretch its success too far. And it's already been said here, we don't need to rush and close deals with the others as well. First of all, we need to see what are the benefits from this agreement between Israel and the UAE, so that others will realize that they better join in, and not to try and crush the Palestinians now even further and to make them even more irrelevant. Israel needs to be very sensitive at this point, and perhaps to even be magnanimous towards the Palestinians, it needs to do four very important things. First of all, a supportive approach in order not to say that this was done against the Palestinians. No, it was done for Israel because of this regional view that sees that the main threat in the region is Iran, and that the Palestinian problem is not the main problem. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's not the main one. And the Palestinians need to understand what their place is, but it doesn't mean that we're completely excluding them from processes. Another thing, we need to do everything we can in order to renew the coordination mechanisms between us and them, because there are certain mechanisms that have been formed and they make the Palestinian Authority redundant in the view of their people, and that's a very bad thing. Therefore, Israel needs to find a way to transfer the funds that we collect for the Palestinians, which belong to the Palestinians. We need to transfer it to them. And the most important thing, Israel and the Emirates, they need to find a way to integrate the Palestinians into the agreement. That is for the Palestinians to receive benefits from this. They need to be involved in various projects that they can benefit from, whether it's energy, water, green energy, or definitely healthcare. And maybe if we can develop a vaccine for COVID-19 together, it's definitely our interest to give this vaccine to the Palestinians as well, to give them the feeling that they can gain something from this and not that it's a zero-sum game. Another thing, Udi, about this linkage between the Palestinian issue and normalization, has it been decoupled indeed, or is it just something unique between us and the Emirates? Yes, it has been broken, you know, once it happens for the first time, then, you know, it can happen again. And we know that there's already interest by other countries, and perhaps they can see how this progresses before they take any measures. So two things have been broken here. One thing that's been broken is that you can maintain a normal official relationship with Israel without having resolved the Palestinian issue. The second thing which is relevant here, the timeline or the order, the sequence of events of the Itai, the Arab Initiative, has changed. In the past, the order was, first of all, take care of the Palestinian issue, reach an agreement, withdraw to the 67 boundaries, and then we will have normalization. Now the equation has changed. Now we can see we can start with normalization. We don't necessarily need to have normalization with all the countries, just with some of the countries, and then we can progress towards the other topics. So there's definitely a change in the sequence of the Arab Initiative. Thank you very much, Udi. Now let's move on to the a more journalistic angle on this agreement. Mr. Barak Ravid from Walla News. Barak, why now? What can explain the timing of this agreement? Well, hi, and thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here, especially with guests from the Gulf. It's truly very moving to be part of such a thing. Why now? Well, I think that it perhaps has to do with what Yoel has mentioned, and Moran also mentioned this, and Udi. The question is, did we actually break the paradigm or not? And I wish to argue something that's different. I would like to argue that the paradigm has not been changed at all. If you ask me why now, I think that with respect to the timing, let's not talk about the essence. If we're talking about the timing, the annexation issue is critical to the timing, and that's part of the same paradigm in my view, that normalization with Israel is somehow related to the Palestinian issue. You need to note that the UAE, it would be, you know, the understatement of the millennium to say that the Palestinian issue is not one of the key topics on their priorities, on their agenda. But with respect to the annexation, if we look, you know, from January, when even before the Trump program, even before the Trump program, the deal of the century, the Emirates already started to take action on the issue of annexation. Why? Because let me remind you, on January 28th, when Netanyahu left the ceremony at the White House, he rushed to say that he will bring to a government meeting the topic of annexation already on Sunday. It didn't happen. One of the reasons for the break he received from the White House is because Yusuf El-Utaiba, the ambassador of the UAE to Washington, and perhaps one of the closest people to Mohammed bin Zayed, along with the ambassador of Bahrain and Oman, they just 2 hours before that, they had participated in the ceremony in the White House, and one of the conditions that Yusuf Lotaida presented to the Americans, he said, we'd love to come, but we don't want to discover that the next day Netanyahu will announce an annexation, and we will look stupid. And he received such a promise, and this was made clear to Netanyahu. He didn't like to listen to that, so he embarrassed himself. But from that point until between January until July 1st, that's what I saw. I'm certain you saw that as well. There was a lot of hectic activity, unprecedented activity against the annexation. Mohammed bin Zayed had never, tweeted before that on the Palestinian issue, but he did tweet against the annexation. And there are so many other examples. The article in Yediot Achnot by Elotai and some more discreet channels with the White House. And perhaps we can argue on whether the Emirates did this because they identified that this was a popular topic that they should, promote, or that they truly care. I believe that they truly care, perhaps not so much because of the Palestinians, but because of the interests that have to do with Iran and Turkey and Qatar. And this thought that if there is an annexation, the Iranians, the Turkish, and the Qataris, they will try to use this against the Emirates on other struggles in other places about the Gulf, Libya, having to do with Syria, things that are completely unrelated to us, but ultimately they are somehow related. So if you ask me why now, I think that weirdly enough, it's thanks to Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalitionary agreement with Benny Gantz, where he truly insisted that July 1st would be the deadline for the annexation. You did interview in the past the foreign minister of Bahrain. Could it be the next country? And maybe there are other countries that you think will take a similar measure? I'm certain that there will be such countries, but I'm not certain that it will happen before the elections in the US. That's my only question mark, because when I try to think whether anyone would like to follow suit of the UAE, I can find a reason for every country why not to do it. Specifically, if we're talking about Bahrain, of course, there's a special relations of the American administration, especially with the air to throne, but there are many elements in Bahrain today who will place warning marks. I think that the new Bahraini foreign minister, he used to be the general secretary of the Organization for Cooperation in the Gulf, the GCC, and before that capacity, he was the Minister of Interior in Bahrain, and he was one of the people who had to deal with the implications of the Arab Spring in Bahrain, the Shiite uprising there. And I think that if there is any discussion held in Bahrain currently regarding this question, whether to normalize the relations with Israel now, I think that the foreign minister El-Zayani is saying, remember what happened back in 2011? Perhaps we should wait a bit, let things sink, and then maybe we should do it at a better timing. Now, regarding other countries, I think that Oman, on the one hand, something very interesting happened there when the Sultan actually replaced all or most of his government. The new foreign minister of Oman, Badr Musaidi, perhaps is the main contact person Israel has in Oman from the day, or at least in the past 20 or even 25 years. And that's a very good sign. But on the other hand, I see it very difficult to see the Sultan opting for such a choice when he still needs to stabilize his regime, his government. Now, regarding Morocco, I think that it is possible, but the harbinger that will tell us if it is indeed happen, the canary in the mine, will we hear an announcement from Washington of recognition of the Moroccan occupation of the Western Crescent? That would be an indication that they're going to normalize the relations with Israel. And I think that the country that we can see the greatest chances it will normalize with Israel is Sudan, because their interest is the greatest to be taken out of the State Department's list of terror countries and to lift American sanctions from them. And Pompeo is going to go to Sudan. I don't think there was a visit of an American Secretary of State to Sudan in I don't know how many years, but it's very, very interesting. I think that the Sudanese at least they have the greatest interest to go for this as quickly as possible. If they were to know that tomorrow they're going to be taken out of the State Department's list of terrorists, then they'll sign an agreement tomorrow. Okay, thank you, Barak. Now let's move on to Noah Landau, political correspondent for Haaretz newspaper. As you look at this triangle, Israel, the US, and the Emirates, what are your thoughts? Why now, and what's the significance? Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I think that the best thing that happened following this agreement is the fact that now we can hold much more joint public discussions, and they can enrich the public discourse and even influence it. I think this is the beginning of a public dialogue we have not seen before. Why now? I think the previous speakers gave you a very good answer to that question. It's no fun being the last speaker. So let me just say all answers are correct. I think that a unique window of opportunities was created here. The relationship that had existed behind the scenes for a long time, for 20 years, and now they have fruition into overt normalization thanks to an American administration that really pushed for it. And just like Yoel and Barbara had mentioned, you know, and also another issue, the declarations of the annexations made it possible for all parties to get off the tree they climbed up, or at least to be depicted as getting off that tree. In the UAE, they can say that they stopped the annexation and they established this relationship that they wanted anyhow as part of their struggle against Iran and Turkey. That's already been mentioned, but maybe not that much. And the issue of the advanced Israeli and American technologies, as for example, the aircrafts, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think that this is the outcome of a long-standing process that just waited to the special junction of circumstances. So we're talking about a very specific event. Of course, we can learn from it and draw lessons, but we need to be very careful not to come out with these bombastic, declarations following this. How do you see the implications of this agreement inside Israel in Israeli domestic politics? Well, regarding Israeli politics, well, we've already mentioned the Palestinian issue. Traditionally, Israeli politics, the Israeli politics was divided into right and left around this issue, but this hasn't been the case for a long time. It's not on the Israeli political radar, and that's a narrative success for the Israeli right. But we will see an attempt of the Israeli right to further entrench this perception that we don't need to make any concessions for peace. And this proves that this agreement with the UAE, I don't think that this is what happened here. I do agree with Barak, Ravid, not regarding maybe the magnitude, that actually the issue of annexation did play a role here, even if it's a role under disguise. On the public level, it did play a role. Therefore, the Palestinian issue is not completely detached from this. But on the other hand, if we look at the internal Israeli politics, we'll definitely see an attempt of the right to further entrench this view that we don't need to make concessions in order to get peace. But on the other hand, if we want to be more optimistic, it's always good to end an event on an optimistic note, then perhaps we could say that the Israeli society, by the mere fact that it, by and large, supported this agreement and gave up on annexation, I think we're talking about 70%, it means that there is a support of a two-state solution, or at least leaving some kind of an opening for this option in the future, because at the bottom line, Israelis have proven that they are in favor of peace and normalization more than they are in favor of annexation. The question is, how can the Israeli left leverage this, if they can at all? I don't have an answer to that question. We need to see how the UAE itself will conduct itself as a player in this field of the relations between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think that at the end of the day, in the shorter term, even on the very short term, let's say up to the next elections, the next elections won't be on this topic. This won't be the inner Israeli political question. Of course, that the pictures of the handshakes we will see from the White House, it will definitely be part of the campaign, but it won't tilt the blocks here. The question of Netanyahu's trial and the conduct during COVID will have a greater impact. And a word as a political correspondent about Israel's position in the world. Does this agreement has some significance? I think that if more than the question of Israel's status, it will impact Israeli foreign relations behind the scenes in the sense that it will become a very significant goal for Israeli diplomats in the upcoming years to, to copy this success, to replicate it. And in addition, we can already see right now how Israel is leveraging these relations in her foreign relations with respect to the diplomatic struggle in Iran. I don't know if you've noticed this, how Netanyahu talked about the snapback in the Americans. He said that Israel is standing proudly alongside the US as other governments in the Middle East are doing, who objected to this quietly and now are supporting it publicly. This has been very much emphasized, and this means that already a short time after the agreement, we can see that this does enable a more open, out in the open front, regional front. Thank you very much, Noah. Maybe some quick responses to what we've heard. Yoel, a few words? Okay. We can see a certain continuity with the foreign relations of the UAE. They want to break conventions. We saw that 2 years ago in Syria when the UAE became the first country, the first Arab country that normalized, that's a different kind of normalization of relations with Assad, with the Assad's regime, no less. Some of the actions that they have taken were bold and dramatic. Barbara Leaf earlier mentioned that they're very ambitious. Not all these actions have succeeded, by the way. There's an argument whether the boycott or siege, choose whatever word you choose, on Qatar. Was it successful? The campaign in Yemen, was it successful? What's happening in Libya? Can we say that that succeeded? It's not that clear. The jury's still out, as they say. And, Mohammed bin Zayed wanted to entrench some kind of achievement, to entrench an achievement within American administration that perhaps it's at the, its last days, and perhaps the next president will be a new president, will be less sympathetic, less supportive. And Barbara also mentioned the special status Israel has in the UAE as the two leading allies of the US in the region. And that's the story here, their desire to get closer to the US, to strengthen this brand of the United Arab Emirates. And I would even add and emphasize, and we talked about this with Udi, has there been a decoupling? And let me reiterate what I said before. I think that this is a new model that has being formed alongside the existing model of the linkage to the Palestinians, and every country, based on its considerations, based on its circumstances and sensitivities, will choose the model, and the model will evolve over time as well. Thank you very much, Yoel. Dr. El-Katbi. Switching to English.
Thank you. With all respect, what has been said about linking the timing of the deal with the US presidential elections, the agreement actually came to reflect a rational and realistic political process that is deeper and much mature than that presumed link. No strategic shifts can be based on short-term calculation. The other thing which I would like to mention here regarding Iran, okay? I think Iran is a big loser here because it pushed all the parties in the Arab world towards normalization with Israel. Now, the UAE also, the fear that why this is linkage to the linkage between the annexation and acceleration with the agreement, that Iran, Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood can, as they always hijack the Palestinian card, and will trade this with the annexation if it happened, and will inflame the whole Arab world, and will get some success in this. Now, this agreement will necessarily lead to the emergence of a new geostrategic and geosecurity environment in the region. Now, it is imperative to set a strategic framework combined with the precise strategies to control and guide the interaction in this environment. Moreover, understanding must be built with friends and partners in the region and in the world in general to ensure the success of this agreement, thereby enhancing security and stability and eventually leading to prosperity and development in the region. Now, regarding the Palestinian and their reaction, and I've mentioned this, Barbara, she was one of the session I had with UCLA in that meeting last week about the Arab Street and the Palestinian Authority. I was saying we left the Arab Street for the Palestinian and we took the bridge. There is opportunities in life. You didn't grab them, you lose them. And you cannot be present to Palestinian grievance and they don't want to move and you have to wait until they move. That's why that step taken by Mohammed bin Zayed to break the deadlock which we are in, to think out of the box, to find another way to solve this problem, to get normalization. And as Oded said, this normalization happened without the resolving or without reaching two-state solution. Here, regarding Saudi also, I want to mention that if somebody came to read Turkey Faisal article in Sharq al-Awsat, he mentioned that they are with peace. Okay, although Turkey Faisal has no position now in the government, but I didn't think that he wrote that without any permission from Mohammed bin Salman or King Salman, that they are with peace and they are not against what UAE did, but they are with the Arab initiative and they are with the state, two-state solution. This is their position. Regarding other regional parties, I would look to Egypt. Of course, I don't think Egypt was happy with that. In terms, when I look to the reaction from their media, it's only Sisi who called and congratulate both countries. But otherwise, I was following their media. Maybe that the Egyptians felt that they lost the leadership in the Arab world, and UAE has too much to do with Israeli than them.
Interesting. You talked about Iran and the radicals. You talked about Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood, and then you talked about Saudi and Egypt. I wonder, from your perspective, does the UAE view itself as part of a camp, a part of an opposite camp in the Middle East, or it is by its own?
Regarding this agreement?
No, regarding the regional issues. Does the UAE view itself as the leader or as part of a camp, or every Sunni state is by its own?
No, I won't say a leader. I would say a regional player who cannot be weighed under the constraints of other not to move. Now, if the Saudi has their constraints, they have the custody of holy shrine. They have those religious groups, still strong groups. You don't have to wait. You have to move. So it's not leadership in terms. Okay, our relation with the Saudi is a part of strategic relationship. You cannot neglect it. But also, you cannot tie yourself with any country that for its own constraints or whatever, doesn't want to move to this direction or other. So you have many threats in the region. Iran is a threat, Muslim Brotherhood is a threat, Turkey is a threat, for UAE, Qatar is a threat. So you have to move and you have to find another partners and allies.
Thank you very much, Dr. El-Katabi, and again, looking forward to see you here in Tel Aviv. Barak Ravid, כמה מילים?
Read a few words. Yes, a few points. First of all, following Yoel's comments, I think this past Friday I interviewed Anwar Gargash, who's a minister in the foreign ministry of the UAE. Something very interesting he said, a word he used 3 times during the interview was leverage. Regarding what this agreement gives the UAE, it gives it a leverage vis-à-vis Israel on political issues, especially on the Palestinian issue. What did he mean? I think this demonstrates that linkage point. Can Israel in 2 or 3 years, would it be easier for the Israeli government to reach decisions on the Palestinian issue when it has a peace accord with the UAE? And it's clear to everyone it won't look like the accords with Egypt and Jordan. We'll have tourism, we'll have business people traveling. It's going to be a warm peace. Ultimately, it will restrict the ability of right-wing governments in Israel to do radical things on the Palestinian issue. That's why it's a good thing. As for the elections in the US, I do think that the UAE, it's very important for them to see that this agreement with Israel received an endorsement in a way that was bipartisan, especially with Biden's statement. It was very important to them because perhaps in just a few months he will become the president of the US. It was important for them to see that they're not, opting for something that could find itself in difficulties because of a change of regime in the US. One last issue that's a warning point for Israel. This is something that people are not talking about at all in Israeli discourse, and we don't hear it in the research discourse as well, but this is the issue of the civil war in Libya, that the United Arab Emirates is leading the support for Haftar, both in supplies of arms and training, and also support for militias. To this date, the Israeli position regarding Libya was that it is not getting involved. I'm not sure that this is indeed what happened, but the declared position is that it doesn't intervene. And I truly hope that this agreement with the UAE won't lead to a situation that someone in Israel will change this position and will somehow get dragged into this measure of the UAE. Thank you, Barak. Noah Landau, and then we'll hear from Udi Dekel. We hardly brought up the issue of how they treated this thing in Israel. And it's very interesting to see how the Israeli mainstream did, on the question of tourism, it was preoccupied mainly on tourism, and they were enthusiastic. We saw TV reports on, tourism packages and hotel prices. And, that's something very nice to see, very optimistic. But on the other side, what's less optimistic is while most of the discussion was exclusively centered on this issue of tourism, we hardly saw any discussion of the thesis presented by Netanyahu regarding this agreement. This discussion we're holding here on all the different angles and layers, we didn't see such a discussion in Israeli public discourse. I didn't see anybody posing questions or challenging the way Netanyahu wanted to present this, including the Palestinian paradigm. Well, I would like to first comment on the regional issue because it did come up. We've seen this process for quite some time that the region is changing. it is operating differently. It has been said here that every country operates according to its own particular interests and doesn't really care much for the problems of the general population. And the countries that were, positive towards the UAE, they said that it's the sovereign measures of a state based on its own interests. And, you cannot have a country, neglecting its interests because of the Palestinian issue. And this was said by the Saudis. We see a realization that every country can reach decisions that are in line with their own interests, with their own needs. Another interesting comment, a paper that was published by the Ibtisam's Policy Center, they said that there are 3 axes created in the region, and this is how I read what was said there. One axis is the Irani Shiite axis that operates and attempts to have an impact on the entire region. The second axis that has developed in the past year or two, that's the Turkish-Qatari axis, with the inspiration of the Muslim Brotherhood that we see are involved almost everywhere. And they're also going to try and enter the Palestinian arena, by the way. The third axis that has now been in the focus, that could bring sanity to this region. The pragmatic countries on the American camp and the Trump program concept is to create a coalition of these countries that will withstand these axes, mainly the Iranian one, not so much the Turkish one. And this agreement gives an opportunity for the evolution, the development of a new axis that could be a central one that will lead to stability and success in this region. Ambassador Leaf, and then Mohan, please.
Thanks. So, I mean, there are a couple comments. I mean, this issue of how the rest of the region is reacting and whether there are axes that are clearly delineated and one more sharply delineated now that could even provide some, as I think Barak said, some negative impetus, not fully positive. I think the singular thing here is Mohammed bin Zayed and the way he's a risk taker. And across the Gulf, you don't have anyone else who is a risk taker like him. And fair enough, Yoel said, whether all of his gambles have played out to UAE's intended benefit in the way forecast is an open question, and I think in Yemen clearly not. And on the other hand, he's cut his losses again in Yemen, where he saw that things were not going according to the original plan, and where the cost was greater than the benefit. And I will just point out there, as in this decision this past week, the unveiling of it, he was ready to step aside from a relationship that has been very high profile and singular in nature also, and that's with the leadership of Saudi Arabia, specifically with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. So again, hard-nosed thinking about what are UAE equities as opposed to wider Gulf, wider regional interests. And so I think that's a space we have to really watch. And yes, Turki bin Faisal and the foreign minister, after almost a week of silence, spoke to the issue. One slightly chilly on the normalization question, Turki bin Faisal, of course, giving it a rosier cast of a rosier sort of praise for the UAE step while making clear that the Saudis are not following. So I think how that Saudi-UAE relationship evolves is a key question for this wider regional implication, and of course for where the US or Israel can gain greater traction. Finally, on Barak's point about Libya, that's a really interesting one. And when I was thinking about this last night, my kind of closing comment in my own mind was that the region is not any longer simply riven by the turmoil that spilled out of the events of 2011, the so-called Arab Spring. It's caught in the maw of two would-be regional superpowers, Iran and Turkey. And this is where this new regional alignment provides an immutable logic, but it can also be a logic to entrammel others into a perspective that perhaps Israel doesn't share. Libya is a mess. The more external powers that are jumping into the mess, the messier it gets. There's been a ceasefire finally called by East and West, and we'll see if it holds like previous ceasefires that did not hold. But the Eastern Med is getting very crowded at this point. So nobody can be against peace. It's, motherhood and apple pie, as we say here in the US. There are enormous benefits to this normalization piece, unquestionably, and for the US as well. But to the degree that this produces a sharpening of what is already a series of really deep going cleavages in the region, I think that's a cautionary note that all of us need to be alert to, and specifically the US government, be it Donald Trump's Washington or Joe Biden's Washington.
Moran.
אז בהמשך לדברים של אודי, הייתי אומרת שאם
to pick up on what Udi said,
אם איחוד האמירויות הייתה יכולה לקדם גם מהלכים בזירה הפלסטינית,
also advance measures within the Palestinian arena, then it would have definitely done that, but it cannot. So what it's trying to do, they're trying to reach this arena through Egypt and now through the Emirates. But just like Dr. Al-Khatib said, that their thinking is long-term. This is strategic long-term thinking, and it's waiting for a change of leadership that will happen in the future, and that's what it's relying on. And I think that what's connecting what we're all saying here is the realization that the impact that the UAE has, and this is something that did not exist in our discourse here in Israel until 10 days ago. There are many reasons for that, and maybe we should discuss that in future discussions. How did it happen that a country that until recently nobody talked about, all of a sudden they're in the headlines, they're in the spotlight? There are many answers for that. I would like to point at one domestic reason, because this is a country where the Arab Spring did not take place. Very little opposition, not because they're silencing protests there, but because people there are very pleased with their leadership. They're satisfied with how this country is conducted. There's a lot of patriotism, and throughout the years it made sure to maintain the balance of powers between the elements in this country, and that means it is confident enough to take such dramatic decisions. What such decision was to implement a certain law 2 years ago that completely changes the contract between the country and its citizen, and this is the second decision to establish a relationship with Israel that was not created through a direct dialogue between the state and its citizens, but thanks to this card that no other Arab leader, I think, has today, hardly any other Arab leader has, to advance relations with Israel without great objection from home. Thank you very much, Dr. Moran Zaga. Professor Hassan Yaari, switching to English.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. A few points. The first one is related to the question of Palestinians. If we look at the history of Israeli-Palestinian issue, we see a movement in favor of radicalization by the Palestinians. This is why I used to say very often that Yasser Arafat was the best friend of Israelis, but unfortunately, he was not appreciated and accommodated in order to reach peace and close the door to more radicalization. We see that, and if there is no, if the Palestinian issue is not addressed, we will see even more radicalization than this one. The second point is related to the question of what Ms. Ibtisam said about the reasons why UAE decided to go along this decision. I believe, although it's very refreshing to hear that UAE, small country in terms of size of population, military capabilities, and so forth, is taking initiative. But I would suggest that the UAE should be more prudent, really. They should not alienate at least the Saudis. Because one of the colleagues mentioned about the access, about the camps and all of those things. I believe that GCC in general needs really to come together in order to create a counterweight to the Iranian intervention in the immediate region of the Persian Gulf, but also in the Middle East. So in that sense, UAE is better to remain as part of this coalition with Saudis and bring more, not less. The last point is about how to handle the Iranians. I believe that, as we saw since the last summer, the attacks against the tankers and so forth, the Iranians have a very important power of nuisance. They can do the things that other countries hesitated to do to this point, attacking against the tankers, against the Aramco installations, and so forth. And they threatened very, very clearly UAE by very harsh words, saying that we will answer. They seem that they are talking on behalf of the Palestinians. They said that we are going to react very harshly, and precisely they mentioned the dependency of the UAE to service, to tourism and so forth for its economy. So I think in this regard, the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, like others, including, I would say, the US, they need really to look at to other players in the region. We did not mention Russia and China. I believe they are going to play a significant role here. Although the relationships, at least what we see in the news between Israel and Russia, they are good, but it doesn't mean Russia is playing its cards openly. So in that sense, Israel needs to continue to have Russians on board. And as for China, China is a newcomer in the region, and I believe that they are going to play a significant role in the region in the years to come. So there too, they have to, UAE and others, they have to create some kind of environment in which this strategic alliance between Islamic Republic and China not to be materialized. It is going to be nefast, I would say, for the countries in the region. China will become a neighbor to all the countries in the region. And we know that China has a very big appetite. So in that sense, it's important to manage China in a way that they will not become too close to the Islamic Republic, because ultimately, if they do, so they have to give something in return for all incredible concessions that they are taking from the Islamic Republic. The same thing with Russia. They try, although Russia tried to manage everybody, every country at the same time, but I would say that at some point, both China and Russia they have to make a clear choice in the region, although they won't like to do that, but they have to do it. So in that sense, I think for the Arab countries, for GCC especially, they have to come together, and they have to address their concerns, if possible, with one voice to Russia, China, US, and so forth. Otherwise, Iran is going to be the most important beneficiary of any kind of breach in this the troubled waters of the Persian Gulf in the south. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now let's ask Dr. Amos Yadlin. We talked about the relationship between Israel and the UAE, between Israel and the other countries in this region. We did not neglect the Palestinian issue. We talked about the battle over the image of this region. And now let's hear your conclusion. Good evening, everyone. I think that this is a very moving conference. It's the first time that we're holding a direct conference out in the open with our colleagues from the Gulf that's broadcast on the internet. And I think that in such a difficult year, And so much of the news this year were bad news. It's very nice that every once in a while there is some good news. And I'm saying this now, and maybe later I'll make some reservations, but peace, that's the name of the game. This is a third peace accord with an Arab country after 25 years in which we did not celebrate such an event. It is very, very important for the Middle East, for Israel, I think even for the world, for the whole world. And I think there's a potential here for peace, and it's already been said here this evening, and I wish to emphasize that a peace that will give us a more correct model, a model of a warm peace, a peace not just between leaders, but between the people, and with economic relations, with commercial relations, tourism, education. I'm certain that if we will know how to establish such a peace between Israel and the UAE, it will be a breakthrough. Now, peace does not just come with this white dove. It comes thanks to joint interests, common values, and a trust that's been built between leaders for at least between the leaders, but preferably between the people as well. Like I said, as I try to analyze, first of all, what are the values that both countries have? And I think that there are many values that the countries share that have led them to this step, whether we're talking about the fact that these are small countries that have developed over the past 50 to 70 years from a desert into modern countries, moderate countries, countries that are against radicalism and extremism, countries that seek stability and peace. I believe that these are very important values which we share with the Gulf countries. The second thing, and it's more interesting, maybe more easier to understand, these are interests. We share the same enemy, that's Iran. That is the embodiment of radicalism in the Middle East, and it's one of three forces. Iran, we have the extremism that is led by the Muslim Brotherhood, by the Turkish-Qatari alliance, and we have the extremism of ISIS. So this interest to fight all three axes of extremism, it's a shared interest. And if we look at our third partner to this agreement, that is the US, both Israel and the UAE, as we've already heard, both see an American trend. I won't say to completely pull out of the Middle East, but perhaps it's taking much less interest in the Middle East after two very expensive wars. They paid a lot in blood. The US is now turning towards a new place, which is a much greater threat for it, is posing a greater threat. That's the Pacific region, and it doesn't need the oil that we have here so much. So there's another interest here as well. I think that the Emirates consider Israel as somewhat of a source, not just for confidence and security, but also for technology and completely civil issues such as medicine, AI, agriculture, innovation, culture, things that they would like to adopt. And there's so much that can be done here if we just know how to build this piece on healthy foundations from bottom down. As for the timing, everybody's asking about the timing. We conducted a very deep research here regarding the ability to do normalization with the moderate, pragmatic Arab world. And our conclusions were that it is impossible because of the Palestinians. I think that a pretty good explanation was given here why that was changed, and the way I see it, the elections in 2020 and the annexation that was supposed to help the two that wanted to go for who wanted to do elections. One is Trump, and that was on schedule, and the second individual is our prime minister, who I guess is interested in another round of elections. They had dictated a desire to reach an achievement here. And that achievement that they wanted to gain from annexation, they realized that it's not going to be such a benefit. It won't have such a significant impact. And as someone who did not like the annexation, I see a double success here. The cancellation of a certain measure that was not good for Israel, that is the annexation, and the strengthening of a peace, which is very good for Israel. So I'm trying to be cautious here, and I don't want to say this here in this open forum, but out of an attempt to find an opportunity to, join the bandwagon of annexation. We're lucky that there was a strategist on the third party of this triangle who took the two parties, Israel and the US, and led them to the right place, which is peace in return for annexation. And I think that one of the most encouraging things, in my view, that is, public opinion in the Arab street. I've been saying to all those who kept saying that the Arab street is an obstacle that we cannot surmount, I've been telling them for years that they simply haven't noticed that the world has changed. The world has changed. We have this lovely gadget. Everybody's on social media. You can't tell people stories and lies. People can see what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Europe, what's happening elsewhere. So the Arab street is changing as well. Maybe not by 180 degrees, but there is a certain change. They are much more willing to accept Israel. It's obvious why it's more the case in the Gulf countries than in other countries, but I do think that this is a source for optimism. The annexation created the opportunity for normalization, and as we've heard, there is a third party to this agreement, and that is the QME, the supply of a means of warfare to the Emirates. And I am certain that all three things together are all involved, are all interrelated. I saw about a week ago, after the White House said that it's not, but then the next day the president corrected and said that it is connected. And it's clear to me that normalization, stopping the annexation, and the QME, all three are part of the package agreement. Maybe it will be presented as two different accords, Israel and the UAE, on the topic of annexation and normalization, and the US with the UAE on the QME and all the other things. The annexation here, to a certain extent, created an opportunity. I don't know if our friends in the Gulf know the story about the rabbi and the goat, but somebody put in the goat into the house, and now taking out the goat, as the story goes, made it possible to take this very important measure. I'd like to respect our research group in the Institute led by Udi, and they brought up this option 2 or 3 weeks ago when we held a discussion on annexation. Udi said maybe we will drop annexation in return for receiving some returns, some benefits from the Arab world, and great experts, former ambassadors from the US, not Barbara Leaf, but others, they said no, that it's inconceivable, that it'll never happen, and yet it did happen. And sometimes what seems as a severe crisis can create an opportunity. And I'd like to say once again that thanks to people with good imagination, people in Washington and people in Abu Dhabi and people in Jerusalem, they all created the right thing. Much has been said about breaking the paradigm of the Arab Peace Initiative, that first Israel needs to accept everything that the Palestinians respect, and only then normalization will follow. Well, I think it's a very important step, the fact that it didn't happen. And yet what Barak Ravid said is also very correct. And others have also said that the Palestinian issue has not disappeared. It did not go away. It's here to stay. And the pragmatic Arab countries who have ties to Israel will continue to exert pressure on Israel. And to a certain extent today, they have yet another lever, some more leverage, because if indeed this peace will bear the fruits we expect it to give, then Israel would not want to lose out. If there are certain topics If people once again think about issues like annexation, they'll definitely reconsider. So we do truly expect a warm peace that would also influence Jordan and Egypt. It will show them that when there's a warm peace, things look much better. And when this peace is denounced in Tehran, Ankara, and Ramallah, and in Gaza, that means that we know that that was the right thing to do. The Palestinians, as usual, never miss out on an opportunity to miss out on yet another opportunity. And, you know, just like Udi said, it's still not the end yet. After Abu Mazen will, you know, leave the stage, I think that this measure can definitely advance some Israeli-Palestinian steps and measures. Maybe finally they'll understand that what Secretary Kerry taught them, that time plays in their favor, actually that's not the case. It's incorrect. That's it. Itai said at the beginning that this is an agreement, and I'm saying let's be cautious. It's not an agreement yet. It's a joint statement. I truly hope that an agreement will follow suit and that it won't take 2 years like it took between Sadat's visit until the peace accords with Egypt were signed. And then all of us, as quickly as possible, will be able to meet not over Zoom, but face to face. That means we need an agreement. We need COVID-19 to disappear. And these are two very positive things. And next time, let's meet either in Abu Dhabi or in Tel Aviv. We would love to see you. And I'd like to thank all the participants and definitely our participants from the Gulf and all the others who have participated. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much, and goodbye.